Have you ever been looking for a new therapist and been totally overwhelmed by all the different kinds of therapy out there? You've got acronyms like CBT, ACT, EMDR, REBT, IFS, or confusing names like somatic experiencing or psychoanalysis. It can all leave you wondering which one's best for me. Which one will help me with my problems the most? In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers Podcast, we'll try to reassure you a little bit by exploring what nearly all of these different therapies have in common. This is a two-part episode, so be sure to tune in next week for part two. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus Network and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. Just a few quick announcements for you before we get into today's episode. If you're looking for comprehensive foundational training in psychedelic-assisted therapy that includes live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space, then check out our courses. We're offering 10% off select courses to PTF podcast listeners, so click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinusnetwork.com/training, where you can use the code PTF10 for that 10% discount. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and myself talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus Network does. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinusnetwork.com/research, where you can learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support the show, here's how you do it. Go to a place like Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a positive rating and review. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the episode with someone you think might enjoy it. Please enjoy today's episode. Well, good afternoon, Dr. Robison. How are you?
Hello, Dr. Steve. I'm doing well, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm good. Excited to talk to you about this topic today. This is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. We talked about discussing what aspects do all effective therapies have in common. In the psychotherapy research literature, this is sometimes referred to as the common factors.
The common factors. I like this topic, this body of research, this important condensing of the alphabet soup that is psychotherapy into what the hell is therapy actually doing, and what parts of therapy are important in the process of helping people grow and transform, helping people wake up and grow up, if you will.
Yeah. The sort of nerdy way of talking about this is what factors present in psychotherapy account for the variance in change that folks experience when they do psychotherapy.
Ooh, you sound like a researcher. I like it.
Well, I was fortunate enough in graduate school to be mentored by some of these big names, at least 15, 20 years ago in psychotherapy outcome research. So people like Mike Lambert and Gary Burlingame. And so they would often talk about this war in some sense, but this conversation between ardents of these different psychotherapeutic approaches, CBT, cognitive therapy, psychodynamic therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, first, second, and third wave therapies, which ones work best for which indications. And the consensus, depending on which meta-analyses you read, motivated by people who like different kinds of therapy, suggests that a lot of that variance, like a lot of what really matters, what's really going on in therapy, is attributable to common factors, meaning things that most psychotherapeutic approaches, if not all, have in common, even if they have different theories of change, theories of way the mind works, and how people develop self-defeating patterns.
Yeah, I remember being struck by the fact that BYU, of all places, without a big kind of academic medical center or whatever, has these kind of world-class psychotherapy outcomes researchers and developing rating scales used so widely, like the OQ.
Yeah, outcome questionnaire. So maybe we can start. We're going to take a lot of our inspiration for today's topic, and maybe we do a part two if we don't get to everything, from Dr. Jeffrey Smith's work. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Dr. Smith?
Yeah, he's been somewhat of a mentor in the APA. We each have an APA, you and me, Steve. So when I Google APA, I think the psychology one is actually bigger. So I have to put APA space psychiatry to get mine, unless I remember, like psychiatry.org. But there are these these working groups at and in between the annual meetings, and he has been running the psychotherapy caucus. What a cool word, huh? Caucus.
Yeah.
What does that mean even? What's a caucus?
Group of smart people? I don't know.
Yeah, a group of smart people, or people who want to learn from smart people, perhaps. But I have certainly appreciated his wise perspective. I think he has this knack for picking out and explaining well these kind of common factors in a practical way, and deconstructing therapy in general. How does therapy work? In fact, his website, I think, is something to that effect. But anyway, he has a textbook on psychotherapy, and I think he trained at Stanford and other places. And I believe his background is in part in he's heavy in the affect avoidance model, which you can kind of guess what it means. And I won't get into that now because we got to get on with our how therapy actually works discussion.
Right. Yeah. And how it works, sometimes there's this term called the dodo bird effect that is the reference to this idea that most of what's great about psychotherapies is held common between the different psychotherapeutic approaches. And depending on which study you look at, some people might say it's anywhere between like 30% and 70% of the variance in outcomes is attributable to these common factors. So
Yeah.
what are
It's
these common
reassuring.
factors? Again, it depends, but generally speaking, you've got, goal, clarity, and collaboration. So do you feel like your therapist understands what you're there for? And do you feel like there's a positive working alliance between you and your therapist on that particular goal? It really makes sense that what you're doing in therapy seems relevant to what you've come there for help for. So goal consensus and collaboration is one. The presence of empathy. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. Like it just feels really good to be regarded by your therapist, to feel like they have compassion for you and they understand what you're feeling.
Yeah. And this may and probably will come up a lot more as we deconstruct things, but it's really interesting to think about these core needs that we each have and lots of ways to describe it, of being seen, held, understood, loved, even celebrated, you could add. But in the therapy room, you can have these quote unquote corrective experiences with some of those things, like the experience of empathy, someone understanding me, someone not reflexively judging me and throwing me out the room, or making me feel more shame. And you can work on those things that come up through the process. Anyway, more on that later, but back to common factors.
Yeah, that corrective experience, which we will get into more later, is really crucial for what Smith calls memory reconsolidation, which is a really important step in the therapeutic change process. But related to a lot of those things you were listing, in addition to empathy, feeling regarded, so the presence of positive affirmation or positive regard, what one of the fathers of modern psychotherapy, Carl Rogers, would say, unconditional positive regard.
Yeah. I like that term, even though it's kind of thought of as what he had to use instead of love, because love was socially unacceptable especially in psychotherapy circles at the time. But unconditional positive regard, it kind of sticks to me as a cool term of its own.
Yeah. Yep. Another one, and there are many others, but maybe I'll end with this one, is the sense of congruence or genuineness. Congruence meaning that what your therapist is saying seems like they really mean it, that it's a genuine expression of positive regard, that you sort of believe the empathy that's coming toward you is also really important.
This is total aside, but I remember seeing recently a couple different versions of leadership qualities, and there are a lot of common things. Like thinking of leaders of organizations, genuineness, authenticity was one of them that was crucial, and I think it's a really important point to name it as a therapy common factor as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it also contributes, these variables overlap a bit, right? It contributes to another really, really important thing, and that is the sort of therapeutic alliance, whether it's the working alliance, but also sort of the emotional alliance between therapist and client. So that how much of that is on board between therapist A, therapist B, therapist C can make a difference between that goodness of fit, right? When people ask me, how do I know what kind of therapist I should see? How do I know if I'm seeing the right therapist? That, do you feel good in their presence? Do you feel like it's a good fit in your gut? And it can just be like a personality clash or sort of a vibe clash, something just, sort of felt intuitively. So if you're not feeling it with a particular therapist, even if they're skilled and kind, it's okay to shift. By some studies, those therapist differences can account for up to 5% of the variance. So there have been some interesting outcome studies on what they call the super shrinks, people who just consistently have really good measured outcomes. And when they look at it, some of these therapists, yes, are very skilled, technically skilled, but they're just like great people to be around, right? They make people feel really, really comfortable.
There are those humans you run into like at the grocery store or wherever who just strike you as, wow, they are so genuinely kind. And, I've been thinking about this. What is it about someone I run into who strikes me as like, that was a sweet moment. That was like such a nice, genuine interaction. I really like running into them. And one of the things that I've identified as a common factor in this kind of on the fly exploration is, a lot of things you listed off, but just being present and listening and authentically being interested, genuinely being interested in the other human is so palpable.
Right. Yeah. Warmth, presence, attentiveness, like you're saying, like really present with you and paying attention. Matters in all kinds of relationships, but doubly so in the therapeutic one, where you're making yourself pretty vulnerable and you're there for help.
Yeah. So I think this is a quote from Jeffrey Smith, but this question of what if all schools of therapy are just different dialects of the same language? And it's a thought-provoking question that I think, like I alluded to earlier, puts me a bit at ease when referring to a therapist for a client, a loved one, or for myself, referring my own ass to therapy now and then, is like, let's put aside the different modalities and look at the common factors. And is this a good therapist who can help me with this place I'm in life?
Right.
And that being said, I'll put the disclaimer that if you want to seek out a therapist for a specific condition, there's a lot to be said about looking at what are the evidence-based modalities. Like we've talked about, we're doing a binge eating disorder study in a research clinic, for example. And in binge eating disorder, there's a form of CBT for binge eating disorder that's thought to be the gold standard, even seems to, even though there's not a direct comparison, do better than approved meds. And not everyone is trained in that kind of approach or condition. And so you do have to balance these things out and know what kind of therapies people are using too. But it puts me at ease that therapists do dish out different modalities. Like I don't know many therapists who just stick to one these days. And so the common factors become important in that situation as well.
It's an excellent point. And remember that statistical variation I shared between 30 and 70%, these common factors accounting for change. So that could vary depending on the struggles that you have, the indication. And so there are some therapies that tend to work better for certain conditions than other therapies, right? I mean, an easy example we often refer to is if you've got a phobia, some kind of exposure and response prevention, some kind of graduated exposure really is a lot better than just sort of reflective listening and empathy, although those things ought to be present too.
Yeah. Okay, so we have this big picture and some of the common factors. What is it about talk therapy that actually helps people improve their mental health condition or symptom burden? Like what's going on? I guess we could try and tease apart.
Yeah, I mean, one way to talk about that is what is going on for somebody. How can we understand what's going on for somebody that brings them to therapy in the first place? And we often talk about like maladaptive patterns in one's life, the way they behave, the way they think, the way their nervous system responds to external cues is not working for them in some way. It's not helping them adapt to their environment. And so that sort of brings to mind, especially this word adaptive, evolutionary explanations for why we are the way we are and how that breaks down. So we've talked about it on the show before, this idea of there are these patterns, and you can use different metaphors and different frameworks to explain these patterns, like internal parts, for example. But there are these patterns that might have served us in some way, or they were a reaction to help keep us safe, especially when we were young, for example, that no longer serve us or don't serve us in every context. And so they are stuck. There are maladaptive patterns that are resistant to change. And that's part of what's maybe sort of brings somebody to therapy is that part of me understands that this isn't serving me, but it continues to happen and I don't feel like I can change it.
Yeah. And, there are lots of ways those show up, but, I just want to point out that it's not just from trauma, big T or capital T. It's like every experience we have, especially in that malleable state as a developing child where you're just growing, learning rapidly, soaking it all in. Pretty much any event that occurs in front of your eyes in childhood that you cannot understand is kind of carried on as a schematic memory. And then there are the traumas or the emotionally intense events too that contribute to that saying we've used on here before. If it's hysterical, it's historical, which basically means causal misattributions from childhood. Like if your reaction to a trigger today is out of proportion to what you might expect it to be, there's a good chance it's stemming from some internal mechanism of vulnerability, some unhealed part, some thing you're carrying on from childhood that has an emotional charge to it.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed out that it's often rooted in childhood, but not always, right? We can have experiences later in life that lead to some of these patterns. And I like this idea of these schemas. Smith points out that these are stored in a way in neurological networks, neural networks. It makes me think of, the book, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. So the body meaning not just the mind, but the entire nervous system. And so that being the case, it's often non-conscious or subconscious. I've had clients describe like, okay, Steve, I get what you're saying to me. I understand it rationally. But in those moments when my emotions are activated, I don't have access to my conscious mind. Like I don't have access to that fancy neocortex, especially the prefrontal part that helps me think rationally. It's these limbic emotions that are in charge.
Yeah. And emotion scheme is, well, I like that Jeffrey Smith comes from this affect avoidance background that really speaks to me as someone who's sought out training in the emotion focus world. And in Les Greenberg, who created emotion focus therapy, talks about these emotion schemes that are pretty much a way our mind organizes, or these brain networks organize our emotional experiences, including the physical sensations, including the thought patterns and behavioral tendencies associated with it. So essentially, it's emotions connected to memories of the self and the situation. And therefore, the emotional response can be recreated again and again, carried forward. The memory of a painful event or a reminder of it can stimulate an emotional response. Just because at first the emotion scheme concept was hard for my brain to wrap its mind around, if you will.
Yeah, it's important to understand, especially in the context of affect avoidance, or what acceptance and commitment therapy might call experiential avoidance, where What's really one of the cruxes of the problem that's perpetuating the maladaptive pattern is part of you trying to avoid experiencing that painful emotion again. So, you think the problem is I have alcoholism, like I have an alcohol use disorder, I'm drinking alcohol, and that is a problem. But there's a second order issue here, and that is that there's a feeling that you're trying not to feel. And alcohol is the tool that you're using for affect avoidance.
Yeah, and that's why you have these really kind of profound, memorable sayings by some kind of astute clinicians or or thinkers in this world, like Gabor Mate says it's it's not about the drug, right?
It's about the pain.
Yeah, it's about the pain. And one other thing I wanted to point out about these deeply entrenched patterns, or entrenched maladaptive patterns, you could call them. We are made up of our patterns, essentially. We are pattern machines, and but there's this distinction between maladaptive and not maladaptive, or adaptive, if you will. Maladaptive being the key of patterns that get you into trouble are the ones that you're going to end up in a therapy chair talking about. But we do create and reshape patterns constantly every day throughout the day as we go about life. And whether we're going about the same pattern pathways or we're pattern interrupting, like brushing your teeth with the opposite hand, for example, to mix it up.
Yeah. And that tendency to notice patterns and to sort of operate one's life according to patterns, if we go back to that evolutionary perspective of the development of the human mind, makes sense as something that has enabled our species to survive. And there are some holdovers from that tendency, like you're describing, that may also contribute to why sometimes we develop maladaptive patterns. So I'm thinking of things like the negativity bias. You can think as a mammal on the savannah, it would be important for us to be especially tuned to sources of potential threat, and sort of not as sensitive to things that are the status quo and just okay. I mean, maybe things that keep us safe, but certainly things that would feel scary. So you layer on top of that primal pattern noticing, system, a self-aware, self-reflective, future projecting, past ruminating neocortex, and you've got a supercomputer that works pretty well, but it's layered on top of some old software, sort of down in sort of the monkey or the lizard brain.
Yeah, and no one's immune to these. Like, all the awareness in the world is great, and it's maybe a prerequisite for changing some of this, but we all end up with patterns, and we all end up with maladaptive patterns, and we're always constantly reshaping and shaping those, consciously or not. But yeah, it's something that it's a common theme for all of us.
So we've kind of been talking about how things get maladaptive, right? What brings a person to therapy? You could even think of them as the common factors that permeate or innervate all DSM diagnosable conditions, or just the things that perturb the human consciousness. Anything else to say on that before we start talking a little bit about, or just sort of dip our toe into therapeutic processes?
Yeah, like let's move there. How do words spoken in a session, and how do our interpersonal relationships in therapy, in this case, affect change or bring about change?
Yeah, I mean, to be really on the nose, we just finished talking about patterns. Talking with somebody in therapy where those sort of compassionate, safe container factors are present is an opportunity to gain insight and then to interrupt, shake up these maladaptive patterns.
And insight without empathy lacks fuel. It's another, I think, Jeffrey Smith nugget. And empathy without insight lacks direction. Mm-hmm. So empathy is what helps open the door for your emotions to safely emerge and be explored.
Right.
In this case, but yeah.
I love that quote when I read it. It makes a lot of sense. Early in my therapy career, I was really good, sort of naturally good at making people feel comfortable and being compassionate and expressing empathy. And I remember watching a video in graduate school of me doing therapy with my supervisor. And he said something like, you're tracking him really well, Steve, but you're not really giving him anything else. This guy is really depressed. What do you have to offer him besides just being nice? And I was like, oh, damn.
Yeah.
There's something else I'm missing here.
Yeah, that's a neat wake up call in supervision.
Man.
Yeah. High five and kick in the pants at once.
Nothing more. Well, there's lots of things more I would say, but it was very anxiety provoking in those early years to have people watch you developing fledgling therapy skills, but so useful.
Yeah. So, do you want to talk about one or two of the change mechanisms, or pick one to start with?
Yeah, I was kind of leaning at this new learning and then extinction of maladaptive patterns. So the new learning is maybe what I was getting at with insight. So there's certainly the validation, the normalization that feels really good, but what happens from there? Like, oh, maybe there are other ways I could look at my problem or other ways of being. I could try on some experiments, stepping outside of my comfort zone.
So you could, to kind of make sure we're on the same page and just describe it extra clearly, these two mechanisms you could think of as extinction being the slow, repetitive reshaping of a pattern by kind of gently shifting it and repeating that, versus this memory reconsolidation mechanism being more of a neuroplasticity critical period, heating up so you can reshape as it cools into a new pattern that can happen more quickly. Do you agree with that kind of oversimplified view?
Yeah. And maybe next time we turn on the mics, we can dive deeper into both of those two things. But I think they're both preceded by, maybe preceded by new learning, or new learning is also happening as those things are happening.
Like the startle mechanism in Pavlovian reconditioning, which is an example of extinction as a change mechanism.
Right. So that happens, as you stated, through some graduated exposure, where, the startle response happens, but they realize that they're actually not in danger. And then over repeated exposure, that startle response sort of deconditions a little bit. But maybe it starts with insight, like we were discussing, like, oh, this is what's happening in my body. And it's happening in my body in response to triggers that are related to an experience I had when I was young, or the lack of a need being met when I was young, or an experience I had as an adult, as a soldier, or in a car accident, or in a relationship betrayal. So yeah, starting with insight and then moving to these strategies of extinction, and then what results is memory reconsolidation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because I think there's a risk of people thinking it's one or the other, or that extinction may be the change mechanism of choice for very repetitive processes. Like, for example, say you're a combat veteran with PTSD and startle every time there's a loud noise. If you reactivate that startle in a safe and supported place, then your cortex is learning the war's over. You don't need it. Everything's okay. We'll get into corrective experience maybe next time. But extinction in this way of the response to startle happens a little more gradually and is not necessarily permanent. And people might think of, okay, I keep going into these relationships or seeking out this binge of whatever, and I need to have this awakening and reshape it that way with this kind of giant transformative experience. But I think what I hear you pointing out, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you need ideally both of these mechanisms at play, and corrective experiences as a third one.
Right. Yeah, this is what Smith points out, right? So we have these three mechanisms of change: new learning, extinction of maladaptive patterns, and memory reconsolidation, which we can get into in more detail. And also, what maybe we'll talk about next time is how this maps onto psychedelic assisted therapy. Because what I was thinking of when you were talking about that was the importance of integration after a ecstatic or flexibility inducing psychedelic experience.
Yeah. So I like that's our big picture, and maybe to kind of round it out for now, we could touch on some of the support functions, the essential support functions, like you were, I think, getting to in the common factors. But what can a therapist do in addition to being kind? What did you learn since that supervision, or what are those important other things besides just being kind and listening well?
Yeah, I mean, those things contribute to that empathic connection, so that needs to be there. But then, and I think Schwartz maybe says this, that therapists, we can be sort of the hope merchant for people who come to us and don't.
Harbingers of hope.
Yeah, holding that for them if they feel a little hopeless, and communicating that hope with confidence, and it should be authentic confidence that things can get better. If we engage in this process, they will.
I think about this every time I go into the room with a client with severe depression, where hopelessness is such a hard part of that I feel for a lot, and realize that if you truly believe that two things, that this will never get better, that hopelessness, and that no one gets it. Like, I want to go help with both those things, and they're really low-hanging fruit in my mind of like trying to understand what is it like to be you, and we can co-regulate hope with the individual in a genuine way, from the place we sit in, having seen that these episodes do lessen, and there are options unexplored, and there is a path forward, even if it's going to take us some hard work and time and patience, perseverance.
Yeah, well said. Another one of these support functions that I think I didn't understand as much earlier on in my career as a therapist, but understand better now, is the co-regulation of arousal. Like that too little is not enough to motivate, too much makes them feel overwhelmed. So you can think about mindfulness activities, that window of tolerance concept in trauma therapies like EMDR or somatic experiencing.
And you're kind of like the elevator. It's a weird analogy, but like, you can sometimes, I think about that, like, you as the therapist, you can be the elevator, helping someone kind of shift gradually up or down in this regulation of arousal. In the example of depression, for example, severe depression, anhedonia, loss of energy, talking slower, even things like that. The therapist's role, you don't want to get sucked into that and contribute to it or match that hopelessness, right? But you can't abruptly like come in with your marching band.
Right. Yeah, it's a hand up, right? It's not grabbing them by the wrist and yanking them up. And all those things contribute to a feeling of safety within which they can not only feel held and understood and validated and normalized, all the things we're talking about, but gently escorted outside of their comfort zone with experiments that allow them the opportunities to do what we were talking about before, extinguish the maladaptive patterns, reconsolidate memory, update the old beliefs with new data, and helping those parts of them that are resistant to change, resistant to feeling that affect that they're fearing, engage with it so they can learn that change is possible.
Yeah, beautiful. This reminds me, perhaps in closing, we'll see what you have to add, Steve, but this idea from Ram Dass, I think he said, all you can do for another person is to be in an environment in which if they wanted to come up for air, they could. And I've heard heard in talks where you've talks about it in other ways, like you will grieve and grieve and grieve, and it'll come up for air and think it's all over, and you'll go back under and you'll go through depressions, and all have that, and we are kind of holding space for each other in life, and being that kind of safe space or that place where someone can come up for air is, I think, a way to think about using these, not just in therapy, but in everyday life and every interaction we have with other beloved humans.
Yeah. Imagine somebody who's suffocating, who didn't know there was air up there. And then you help them see that there is, and they get to experience the breath of fresh air. And even if those parts of them bring them back down under the surface and they suffocate again, they have that new experience as a bookmark. And so you help them follow those breadcrumbs back up to eventually they set up shop up where the air is. One way of thinking about what we're doing in psychotherapy.
Yeah. Well, I would love to carry this topic on forever, but I have to do some patient care this afternoon, Steve. So I better run. But how about we plan on a part 2 for next week?
I love it. So hopefully that whetted everybody's appetite, and they'll come back for part 2. We'll dive into some of these things a bit more deep.
Cool. Thanks, Steve.
Reid. Bye-bye. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus Network, a company committed to helping people heal and be well by delivering technology-driven clinic support, clinical trial research, and comprehensive practitioner training in psychedelic-assisted therapy. You can learn more about Numinus Network at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. You can leave a rating or review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the YouTube videos, and share the show with somebody you think might enjoy it. If you're interested in comprehensive training in psychedelic-assisted therapy, check out our courses at numinus.com/training. These courses are carefully crafted by Numinus professionals like myself, Reid, and others, and include live online classes, experiential learning, and opportunities to connect with a diverse community of practitioners in the psychedelic medicine space. I really love teaching these courses and connecting with you all, so check out numinus.com/training, and I hope to see you at the next training cohort. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.